Imagine finding out the hero protecting you from a terrifying stalker is actually the one sending the threats, and he's just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Broomfield, Colorado, is a place where families come to build futures. It is a community that values stability, safety, and the quiet rhythm of suburban life. For Kristil Krug, a 44-year-old biochemical engineer, mother of 3, and avid dancer, life in Broomfield seemed to be the embodiment of that American dream. She was a woman who balanced the rigors of a high-level scientific career with the joy of movement and the deep responsibilities of motherhood. To the outside world, the Krug household was a picture of success. Kristil and her husband, Daniel, had been married for 16 years, a lifetime of shared history and partnership. Daniel was a respected employee at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, a role that suggested a commitment to the well-being of his community. But beneath this polished exterior, the foundation of the Krug marriage was crumbling. By late 2023, the 16-year union had reached a breaking point. Kristil had made the difficult decision to seek a divorce and had begun sleeping in a separate room, a physical manifestation of the emotional distance that had grown between them. This wasn't just a quiet drift. It was a fracture that Daniel Krug refused to accept. While Kristil looked toward a future of independence, Daniel began looking for a way to pull her back. However, he didn't use flowers or therapy, he used fear. He didn't use love, he used psychological warfare. As we peel back the layers of this case, we find a story that is less about a sudden explosion of violence and more about a slow, agonizing campaign of digital terrorism. Daniel Krug wasn't just a husband who lost his temper, he was an architect of terror who manufactured a crisis so he could step in as the hero. He began to view Kristil not as a partner, but as a subject to be manipulated and controlled. This is the story of how a man used his technical knowledge and his intimate knowledge of his wife's life to weave a web of fear that ultimately ended in a cold-blooded ambush in a family garage. It is the case of a puppet master who thought he could control the narrative of his wife's life and death, only to be undone by the very digital tracks he thought he had hidden. In October 2023, Kristil's world began to shift in a subtle, terrifying way. She started receiving messages from a mysterious entity calling himself Kickman. This wasn't just an anonymous troll. The stalker claimed to be someone from her past, specifically her high school ex-boyfriend, Anthony Holland. The messages were sent from a Gmail account, hollandkicks@gmail.com. For Kristil, the sudden reappearance of a ghost from her past was jarring. The messages suggested that she was being watched, that her every move was being monitored by someone who held a grudge or a dangerous obsession. What Kristil didn't know was that Kickman didn't live in the past. He lived in her house. Daniel Krug had created this digital phantom to impersonate Holland, a man who lived miles away in Utah and had no idea his identity was being hijacked for a terror campaign. Daniel's goal was as chilling as it was calculated: hero complex, stalking. By manufacturing a threat from an outside predator, Daniel hoped to force Kristil into a state of total dependency. He wanted her to feel that the world outside was dangerous, that her ex-boyfriend was a monster, and that he, Daniel, was the only one who could protect her. This is a classic MOO. For a specific type of domestic predator, the man who creates a fire just so he can be the one to put it out. Throughout November, Daniel leaned into this role. He would share in Kristil's fear, acting as the supportive husband while secretly drafting the very emails that were keeping her awake at night. In one particularly manipulative move, Daniel sent Kristil a photo of himself arriving at his workplace. He claimed the stalker had sent it to him as a warning that both of them were being watched. It was a brilliant, sinister stroke of psychological bonding. By pretending to be a fellow victim, Daniel effectively erased any suspicion that he could be the perpetrator. He wasn't just her protector, he was her brother in arms against a digital ghost. But even as they bonded over the threat, the digital tracks were already being laid that would eventually lead Broomfield investigators directly to Daniel's desk at the Department of Public Health. The campaign against Kristil was not just a series of mean emails, it was a systematic dismantling of her sense of safety. Daniel Krug understood the power of digital footprints. As an employee of the state's public health department, he had access to networks and technical tools that the average person might not fully grasp. He used this knowledge to make Kickman feel omnipresent. The stalking was designed to make Kristil feel that no matter where she was, at home, at work, or out in the community, she was being observed. Daniel was essentially gaslighting her on a massive scale, reinforcing her fear by confirming details that only someone with intimate access to her life would know. However, even the most meticulous puppet master makes mistakes when his arrogance exceeds his technical caution. While Daniel was building his dossier against Anthony Holland, he was creating a smoking gun of his own. Forensic technicians would later trace the creation and access of the Kickman Gmail account to a very specific location, the password-protected network at Daniel's own workplace. Daniel was literally drafting his wife's nightmares while sitting at his government job. He likely felt shielded by the bureaucracy of the state, assuming that a state network would be too complex or too protected for local police to penetrate. But the digital web didn't stop at IP addresses. Investigators also discovered a burner phone used in the stalking campaign. This phone was meant to be the stalker's direct line to Kristil, a device that couldn't be traced back to the Krug home. But Daniel carried this burner phone with him. Cellular data analysis would later show a GPS tandem that was impossible to ignore. The burner phone moved in near-perfect synchronization with Daniel's personal phone on multiple occasions. When Daniel went to work, the stalker went to work. When Daniel went to get coffee, the stalker was right there with him. This data provided a literal map of his deception. It showed that the shadow Kristil was so afraid of wasn't lurking in Utah. It was riding in the passenger seat of her husband's car. By the time December rolled around, Daniel's initial goal of control was failing. Kristil was still moving forward with her life, and the police were starting to look into the Kickman reports. The puppet master realized that his strings were beginning to tangle. As December 2023 progressed, the pressure on Daniel Krug reached a fever pitch. Broomfield police were no longer just taking reports. They were conducting a formal investigation into the stalking. Daniel, ever the observer, realized that the investigation was moving dangerously close to his digital tracks. He knew about the workplace IP address. He knew about the gift card he had used to purchase the burner phone. Prosecutors would later argue that this was the moment the motive shifted from control to survival. He realized that if Kristil found out he was the one terrorizing her, he would lose everything: his marriage, his career, and his freedom. He decided that the only way to silence the witness was to eliminate her. On December 13, 2023, Daniel Krug sat at his workplace computer and performed a series of searches that stripped away any pretense of a snap decision. He wasn't looking for divorce lawyers or counseling. He was researching head trauma and unconsciousness. He was looking for the most effective way to incapacitate a human being. This was the cold, clinical calculation of a man who viewed his wife as a problem to be solved with biological and physical force. He was preparing for an ambush, studying the mechanics of a blunt force strike to ensure that when he moved, Kristil wouldn't have a chance to fight back or scream. This premeditation is what elevates this case from a domestic tragedy to a first-degree murder. Every click on that keyboard was a step toward the garage on Brightwood Drive. While Kristil spent that Wednesday evening preparing for the next day, perhaps checking on her 3 children or thinking about her dance practice, Daniel was mentally rehearsing a murder. He was a state employee, a father, and a husband, but in those moments at his desk, he was a predator finalizing his kill plan. He knew her schedule perfectly. He knew that Thursday morning, December 14th, she would be vulnerable. She would be returning from school drop-off, a routine moment of transition when her guard would be down. The hero complex had fully curdled into a lethal obsession. The puppet master was ready to cut the strings for good. The morning of December 14th, 2023, began like any other for Kristil Krug. She performed the school drop-off for her children, a task that defined the start of her day as a dedicated mother. She returned home to the family garage around 8 a.m., likely already thinking about her work as a biochemical engineer or the tasks she needed to complete before the holidays. She stepped into the garage, a space that should have been the final threshold of safety. Instead, it was where Daniel was waiting. He didn't greet her. He ambushed her. Using the research he had conducted just 24 hours prior, Daniel struck Kristil with a blunt object, likely aiming to render her unconscious or incapacitated as his workplace searches suggested. But he didn't stop there. He followed the blunt force trauma with a fatal stabbing. The violence was swift, brutal, and entirely one-sided. In the span of a few minutes, the woman who had been Daniel's partner for 16 years was killed in the very home they had built together. But Daniel's puppet master instincts didn't shut off after the killing. In fact, they went into overdrive. Between 8:15 a.m. and 8:24 a.m., while his wife lay deceased in the garage, Daniel began a series of forensic cleanup steps designed to keep his narrative alive. He used Kristil's own phone to disable the home security system, ensuring there would be no electronic record of his movements inside the house after the attack. He then took a roll of blue masking tape from their kitchen, the same tape used for household projects, and used it to cover the doorbell camera. He wanted to create a blind spot for investigators, a gap in the timeline that he could fill with his own lies. He even took the time to schedule a text message to be sent from her phone to his later that morning, a digital alibi designed to show that Kristil was still alive and well long after he had left for work. This wasn't the behavior of a man in shock. It was the behavior of a man who was still trying to direct the play, even as the lead actress lay dead at his feet. One of the most chilling aspects of the day Kristil was murdered is Daniel's demeanor in the hours following the attack. After killing his wife and meticulously staging the scene, Daniel didn't hide in a state of panic. At 9:15 a.m., just over an hour after the murder, Daniel stopped at a local coffee shop for a latte. Surveillance footage and witness accounts described him as remarkably calm. He wasn't disheveled, he wasn't shaking. He was a man who had checked a difficult task off his to-do list and was now moving on with his workday. This coldness is perhaps the most defining trait of Daniel Krug, the ability to pivot from extreme violence to the mundane rituals of suburban life without a flicker of remorse. While Daniel sat at his office, he continued to play his role. At 8:56 a.m., the text message he had scheduled from Kristil's phone arrived on his own. To anyone looking at the phones, it appeared to be a routine check-in between a husband and wife. It was a text from the grave, a piece of digital deception that Daniel hoped would push the time of death later into the morning, a time when he could prove he was already at work. He was creating a wall of digital evidence to shield himself from the physical reality in his garage. By noon, Daniel decided it was time for the discovery. He called for a welfare check from his office, claiming he hadn't heard from Kristil and was growing concerned. At 12:28 p.m., police arrived at the Krug home and discovered Kristil's body in the garage. Daniel played the part of the grieving, shocked husband to perfection. He spoke of the Kickman stalker. He directed police toward the emails and the threats. He handed them a dossier of information he had compiled, all of it pointing toward one man, Anthony Holland. He was handing the police a pre-packaged suspect, hoping they would follow the trail he had so carefully laid out. But Daniel had forgotten one thing. The blue masking tape he used to cover the camera wasn't just a tool. It was a physical link to his own kitchen. Forensic analysis would later show that the tape on the camera was a perfect match to a roll found inside the house, a domestic item used in a domestic murder. For a brief period, Daniel's plan actually worked. The Broomfield police, presented with the Kickman evidence and Daniel's helpful dossier, focused their attention on Anthony Holland. Holland, the high school ex-boyfriend who lived in Utah, became the prime suspect in a homicide investigation. The trauma of the situation moved across state lines as police raided Holland's home. Imagine being Holland, living your life, years removed from your high school relationship, only to have your door kicked in by police who believe you are a calculated killer who stalked and murdered a woman in Colorado. Daniel had built his frame up around the Kickman identity, assuming that the history between Kristil and Anthony would be enough to convince a jury. He relied on the hero complex narrative he had fed Kristil for months. If the police believed Anthony was the stalker, it was only a small jump to believe he was the killer. But the puppet master hadn't accounted for the simple, unshakable power of a solid alibi. Anthony Holland wasn't a digital ghost. He was a real person with a real life in Utah. Investigators quickly discovered that Holland had an airtight alibi for the morning of December 14th. He had a sweatshirt receipt from a store in Utah that placed him hundreds of miles away from Broomfield at the time of the murder. His cell phone data confirmed his location, showing that he never left his home state. In an instant, Daniel's carefully constructed suspect evaporated. When the frame-up failed, the police had to look back at the only other person who had intimate knowledge of the Kickman stalking, the house, and the security systems. They looked back at Daniel. And this time, they didn't look at his dossier. They looked at his digital footprint. They looked at the state computer he used to draft those emails and the state computer he used to research head trauma. The hunter was now the hunted. As the investigation into Daniel Krug deepened, a dark pattern began to emerge that suggested Kristil wasn't his first subject. This wasn't a sudden descent into madness for Daniel. It was the refinement of a playbook he had used years earlier. Evidence emerged that Daniel had engaged in a nearly identical stalking campaign against a former girlfriend. In that prior instance, he also created fake identities to harass the woman, only to step in as her protector to maintain the relationship. This revelation was the key to understanding Daniel's psychology. He wasn't a man who feared for his wife's safety. He was a man who feared his own irrelevance. He used manufactured crises to prevent his partners from leaving him. When the hero complex worked, he felt powerful. He felt in control. But when it failed, when the woman saw through the ruse or decided to leave anyway, Daniel's only remaining tool was extreme violence. The prior stalking history showed that Daniel viewed relationships as a game of manipulation. He didn't see his partners as equals. He saw them as people to be managed through fear. This hero complex reinforcement was a long-term psychological pattern. It explained why he was so comfortable impersonating Anthony Holland. He had done this before. He had sent the fake emails. He had shared in the fear. And he had enjoyed the bonding that came from a shared threat. But Kristil, a biochemical engineer with a sharp, analytical mind, was different. She was seeking a divorce. She was sleeping in a separate room. She was breaking free of the puppet strings. For a man like Daniel, who defined himself by his ability to control his partner's reality, Kristil's independence was a threat that he felt he had to solve permanently. The playbook had worked once before, but in Broomfield it would eventually lead him to a life sentence. The legal proceedings against Daniel Krug were a masterclass in forensic reconstruction. On April 17, 2025, a jury in Broomfield sat and listened to the evidence that dismantled Daniel's puppet master scheme. They saw the GPS data showing the tandem movement of his phone and the burner phone. They heard about the workplace IP address used to create the Kickman account. They saw the blue masking tape from the Krug kitchen and compared it to the tape found on the garage camera. And they heard about the text from the grave that Daniel had so arrogantly scheduled to create his alibi. The defense tried to paint Daniel as a man caught in a tragic set of circumstances, but the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. The Google searches for head trauma on December 13th were the final nail in the coffin. You don't research how to knock someone unconscious the day before they are murdered in your garage, unless you were the one planning to do it. The jury didn't take long to reach their verdict. Daniel Krug was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, stalking, and criminal impersonation. On April 18, 2025, Judge Priscilla Lowe brought the Puppet Masters show to a final, permanent end. She sentenced Daniel Krug to life in prison without the possibility of parole, adding an additional 9.5 years for the stalking and impersonation charges. During the sentencing, the true cost of Daniel's obsession was laid bare. 3 children were left without a mother, a family was shattered, and a woman who had spent her life dancing and solving complex biochemical problems was gone because her husband couldn't handle the word divorce. Daniel Krug had spent months trying to control the narrative of his wife's life. In the end, the only thing he controlled was the date he would begin spending the rest of his life in a 6-by-9-foot cell. As of 2026, Daniel Krug remains incarcerated in the Colorado Department of Corrections, where he will serve out the remainder of his life. The Puppet Master is now just another number in the state system, his technical skills and state job a distant memory. But for the community of Broomfield and the family of Kristil Krug, the healing process is ongoing. Kristil is remembered not for the way she died, but for the vibrant way she lived. As a scientist, a dancer, and a mother who fought for her independence until the very end. The case of Kristil Krug serves as a chilling warning about the modern face of domestic abuse. It is a reminder that stalking doesn't always come from a stranger in a dark alley. Sometimes it comes from the person sharing your bed, using your own Wi-Fi to terrorize you. Daniel Krug used digital tools to manufacture a crisis, but he was ultimately undone by those same tools. His case highlights the vital importance of digital forensics in modern homicide investigations. The IP addresses, the GPS data, and the scheduled texts were the silent witnesses that Kristil couldn't provide. Today, we honor Kristil's memory by telling her story, not the story Daniel tried to write for her, but the truth. She was a woman who was loved, respected, and deeply talented. Her life was a testament to strength and intelligence. While Daniel Krug will be remembered as a coward who hid behind a state computer in a roll of blue tape, Kristil Krug will be remembered as the light that his darkness couldn't ultimately extinguish. Her story is a call to vigilance, a reminder that the hero, who claims to protect us from a manufactured ghost, might just be the one holding the knife. If you found this deep dive into the legal and psychological layers of this case meaningful, please subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot. Don't forget to hit the like button if you appreciate the effort that goes into uncovering these real-life cases. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and I'll see you in the next video.